Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing here in the Chemical Safety, Waste Management, Environmental Justice, and Regulatory Oversight Subcommittee on establishing a national deposit return system for beverage containers. In my home state of Oregon, a man named Richard Chambers went out for a walk on the beach one morning in 1968, and he was pretty disturbed seeing the beach littered with empty bottles. So Mr. Chambers called up his state legislator, Paul Hanneman, and brought him down to the beach to see the accumulated mess. And that moment was the beginning of what became Oregon's bottle bill, the first statewide bottle recycling legislation in the country. And when the bill was up for debate in the legislature in 1971, folks said that it was pretty intensive opposition, but the legislators decided to give it a try. And thank goodness they succeeded. Thanks to that bottle bill in Oregon and the modifications that have been made over the years, Oregon regularly has a bottle return rate between 80 and 90%. Most recently in 2022 hit 88.5% redemption. Oregon is now one of 10 states, red and blue, with a deposit return system that allows citizens to recycle used containers. But 40 out of 50 states don't have deposit return for beverage containers. And without a deposit return system, there are much lower rates of recycling, much higher rates of litter. Here's a few numbers. For plastic bottles, states without deposit return have a recycling rate of 17% versus states that do have a deposit return system at 57%, a 40% difference. For aluminum cans, the distinction is 41% difference between 36 and 77%. For glass bottles, a 44% difference between 22% and 66%. So a nationwide deposit return program could have a lot of benefits. The Container Recycling Institute, represented here today by Susan Collins, one of our witnesses, estimates that a national container deposit return system could create 100,000 jobs. Meanwhile, we spend a lot of money across the country on litter cleanup, $11.5 billion a year, most of it paid by businesses. So there's potential significant savings for business and for government. And recycling also reduces global warming gases. A national deposit return system, if it had a rate of close to 90%, it would save about 11.2 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions, or to translate that, that's like taking 2.4 million cars off the road. But to do all of this, we need a lot of partnership and cooperation. We need to dive into the complexities of the different chemicals that make up bottles, understanding what the different paths are. So there's a lot of work to be done to envision a system that could work nationally. And I have noticed a lot more interest as more states have had recycling systems, as more attention is given to the challenge of plastics. Certainly there's more consideration that perhaps a national system rather than 50 different systems might make a lot of sense. So that's what we're here to explore today. And I'll now turn to our ranking member, and I'll introduce our witnesses after his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all the witnesses for attending this hearing. Just to let you know, I'm unfortunately going to have to make an opening statement, and then I have to run to another hearing, and I'm going to try to come back, but I don't know how that's going to work out, so I apologize. I do have questions that I'll submit for the record before I leave, though. But anyways, thank you so much. It is, I mean, no disrespect by having to leave. It's a little busy right now. This whole thing about a shutdown or something, I don't know what that's all about. But I'd like to start by once again thanking our witnesses here, including Steve Alexandria from the Association of Plastic Recycling. Thank you for taking the time. We appreciate you being here with us today. As we have seen in America as well in other countries, a one-size-fits-all federal mandate is not always the best economical solution for everyone, especially in smaller businesses. Take Germany, for example, which everyone knows to be the poster child, along with South Korea, for recycling rates. In 2022, according to the German Brewers Association, private brewers across Germany participating in a bottle back program experienced an extreme shortage of beer bottles, not because of a lack of bottles, but because of the lack of incentives for customers to return the empty bottles due to multiple other factors. What a lot of people don't consider is that a forced refillable incentive can result in an unintended hassle and tax on consumers, especially in rural and underserved communities. Bottle bills also have a negative impact on local municipalities because plastic bottles are often the most valuable commodity streams that municipalities' recyclers use to fund their operations, resulting in revenue loss and effectiveness of local curbside recycling programs. If we push for legislation that imposes a one-size-fits-all approach, we'll lose the opportunity to successfully increase America's recycling rates and harm local municipalities and rural states while doing it. One focus should be aimed at addressing accessibility, awareness, ensuring reliable availability of post-consumer material for recycling industry in a cost-effective manner. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Mullen. And can you please go make sure we don't have a shutdown?
I'm working on it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And we're turning now, where are we? We are fortunate to be joined by 3 witnesses today who will share their expertise with many benefits of these systems. We're joined by Jules Bailey, Chief Executive Officer and President of the Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative, which operates Oregon State's beverage container recycling system. And joining us also is Susan Collins, President of the Container Recycling Institute, which seeks to make North America a global model for the collection and recycling of packaging materials, and compiles a whole lot of statistics of use to those trying to understand the various options and their success in designing systems of reuse or recycle. Also today with us is Steve Alexander, President and CEO of the Association of Plastic Recyclers, a trade organization whose members span the entire recycling process from design to collection to recovery to remanufacturing. So thank you for joining us all today. And now we'll turn first to Susan Collins.
Thank you, Chair Merkley. The Container Recycling Institute appreciates the opportunity to provide comments on solutions to address beverage container waste in the United States. CRI is a nonprofit organization and leading authority on the economic and environmental impacts of used beverage containers and other consumer product packaging. I'll start with an overview. The inability to effectively recycle beverage containers in most states is increasingly contributing to our plastic pollution, marine debris, and climate crises. However, we know that one solution works: deposit return systems, or DRS, which enable consumers to return empty bottles and cans to a redemption location and receive back the deposit they paid upon purchase. Decades of data show that these systems are the single most effective way to increase container recycling rates, reduce associated litter and marine debris, lower energy use, avoid greenhouse gas emissions, decrease waste collection and landfilling costs, and provide more high-quality scrap that manufacturers need to make new products. A national DRS would also maximize the recycling of beverage containers to support economic growth and create new domestic manufacturing jobs. Next, I'll describe the multiple problems we are trying to solve. Sales of packaged beverages continue to grow at a rate that outpaces population growth, with the lion's share coming from bottled water. In the last 25 years, plastic water bottle sales have grown almost tenfold, from 8 billion with a B to 86 billion per year nationwide. Meanwhile, recycling rates have remained stagnant, resulting in increasing amounts of beverage container waste, now nearly 13 million tons per year. Containers wasted rather than recycled must be replaced with more virgin materials, which results in greater energy use and carbon emissions. Littered containers also harm our marine life and pollute our soil. And as the Senator said, Keep America Beautiful has estimated litter cleanup costs at more than $11 billion annually. But the scrap value of beverage container materials wasted each year would be worth more than $2 billion if we recycled them instead. The tonnage of aluminum cans alone wasted in 2019 is enough to rebuild the entire 2021 U.S. fleet of commercial aircraft 17 times over. The amount of energy required to replace the number of beverage containers wasted annually is enough to power 3 million households. The good news is that there is a solution to these problems, and that is a national DRS. Here's how this works. When a retailer buys beverages from a distributor, a deposit is paid to the distributor for each can or bottle purchased. The consumer then pays the deposit to the retailer when buying the beverage. The deposit is refunded when the consumer returns the empty beverage container, with options that may include a retail store or a redemption center with or without reverse vending machines or bag drop. The retailer recoups the deposit from the distributor plus an additional handling fee in most U.S. states. This helps cover the cost of handling the containers. DRS create a privately funded collection infrastructure for beverage containers and make producers and consumers, rather than taxpayers, responsible for their packaging and waste. They also typically have very high redemption and recycling rates, achieving an average of 82% worldwide. Among other benefits, a national deposit return system would achieve an 80% return rate for beverage containers given a 10-cent deposit, cut beverage container litter in half, as found by Keep America Beautiful in their national litter study in 2020, create over 80,000 new direct jobs, provide cleaner, high-quality material without breakage or contamination, which often occurs in curbside systems, support domestic container material industries with more than 8 million tons of additional recyclables, save municipalities and taxpayers money because the cost for beverage container recycling would be shifted to beverage distributors. A national DRS program could also support the return of refillables in the United States. And a national DRS would eliminate greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to taking nearly 2 million cars off the road. The adoption of beverage container DRS continues to grow at a skyrocketing pace worldwide. In just the last 7 years, new laws have been announced that will include nearly 500 million people in DRS systems. Lastly, the popularity of DRS in the United States was demonstrated in 2020 by a public attitude survey conducted by the Keep America Beautiful group, in which 75% of those surveyed indicated support of deposit laws. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Collins, and now we'll turn to Mr. Bailey.
Thank you, Senator. Pleasure to be with you here this morning. My name is Jules Bailey, and I am President and CEO of the Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative. We're a cooperative composed of Oregon beverage distributors, and we're responsible for all aspects of the Oregon program, from handling the deposits and refunds to operating redemption centers to trucking, processing, and even marketing the material. Our vision is a world where no resource is wasted. Beverage containers aren't waste. The glass, plastic, and metal materials that compose the packaging, and even the containers themselves, in the case of refillable bottles, are resources that can be used again and again. You can see in this excerpt from our 2022 annual report, we're pretty good at what we do. The bottom line is we have a better redemption rate than any other system. We operate at the lowest cost per container in the United States and maybe the world, and we offer some of the most inconvenient return options of any program. Last year, we turned over 2 billion glass, metal, and plastic beverage containers into grade A, high-quality recyclable material, offsetting not only virgin material, but also producing the kinds of materials that are put into the global market by Russia and China. We also run the nation's only statewide refillable bottle program with nearly 3 times more bottles in circulation than the system in Paris, France. And we're not done yet. Next slide, please. We continue to expand access, and our flagship, the Green Bag Account Program, now has over 1 million signups in a state with only 1.5 million households. We have more than 5,600 nonprofits signed up in our state, which received nearly $6 million last year for organizations ranging from wildland firefighting to preschools to homeless shelters and everything in between. So how'd it happen? Oregon, as Senator mentioned, had the first bottle bill in the nation in 1971, and the legislature didn't have a roadmap. So instead, it set the refund value of the container and assigned responsibilities. The legislature asked the beverage distributors to figure out the rest, and over time, they did. The term extended producer responsibility, or EPR, has recently come into fashion, and yet while no one in 1971 would have understood that term, Oregon's bottle bill was really the nation's first EPR program. We're now implementing EPR for other kinds of packaging, but that remains distinct and separate from the DRS. The primary feature of Oregon's deposit return system is that industry is responsible for all costs and all benefits of the program, with 4 fundamental principles. 1, industry pays for all aspects of the program and accepts no public funding. 2, industry invests unclaimed refunds above the target redemption rate into operating and improving the system. 3, industry keeps the scrap material, allowing for full material circularity. And 4, no handling fee exists in Oregon, which allows OBRC to be a central system operator at scale. We've evolved into this over 50 years, and Senator Merkley, when he was still Speaker of the House, Jeff Merkley, shepherded a major set of reforms that expanded Oregon's bottle bill and allowed industry to coordinate as a cooperative, creating OBRC as we know it. But ultimately, there are only 2 things that affect whether a bottle bill is successful: convenience and incentive. A system with high incentives will fail if there is no convenience, but likewise, the most convenient system in the world will fail without an incentive. Curbside recycling is just such a system, and the highest performing curbside systems fail to get back more than around 40% of beverage material, and often much less, and the quality is usually lower. Even if the quality increases, without an incentive, it won't be enough volume to supply the needs of the American recycling infrastructure, like the new aluminum plants being built in the South. So how do we do convenience? First, Oregon law created room for innovation by allowing industry to work out the details in the private market. In Oregon, government regulators act more like referees than coaches or players on the field. Second, OBRC created a strategy for customer segmentation, allowing for return pathways that make sense for different users. We have fast, high-volume return options for those that want cash. For others, the green bag program means families can just place glass, plastic, and metal containers in the same bag and drop them off at a redemption center or store when they go do their shopping. And you can see that here in the next slide. Most Oregonians use this method. Still others are motivated to redeem containers for their local charity, church, or school. And third, OBRC makes it easy for you to use your money. We have an app that allows you to use Venmo, PayPal, bank-to-bank transfer to move your money. You can donate your balance to a nonprofit or connect it to a kid's 529 college savings plan, or even spend it for in-store credit with a 20% bonus. None of these innovations were mandated. Rather, the flexible structure of Oregon's deposit return law allowed them to happen. Final slide, please. But at the end of the day, the most important statistic is our customers. Do they like it? People are voting with their feet. There's a lot of info on this slide, but this is the whole system summed up in one graph. You can see a dozen years ago, 90% of returns went directly back to large grocery stores with only 1 billion containers redeemed, and a lot more unclaimed refunds compared to the number of containers processed. As the refund value changed from a nickel to a dime, we expanded to cover nearly all beverage types and invested in convenience and access. Now, nearly 80% of returns come directly back to us, and we're doing twice as much volume directly through our network with a fraction of the unclaimed refunds. And it's popular. 94% of Oregonians are familiar with our deposit return system. 97% of those say it's good for Oregon. And in fact, when we look at the crosstabs, our strongest supporters are consistently older, rural, and Republican. We enjoy broad bipartisan support in the legislature, and we take that responsibility to steward that goodwill very seriously. So as you examine a national deposit return system, we should look at the principles of the Oregon model. We've had 50 years to build the program, and not every state will look the same. But the principles of government facilitation over regulation, empowerment of the private sector to do what it does best in service of public goals, that should be at the heart of a national system. It won't be one size fits all, and we'll need to allow for successful statewide systems to continue operating. But the benefits of a national framework are large. Fewer cross-border issues, more recyclable material at higher quality to build American industry and jobs, and the opportunity to do reusable packaging at scale. So let's make sure that in America, no resource goes to waste. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Mr. Alexander.
Thank you, Chairman Carper. Members of the committee, my name is Steve Alexander, and I'm the President and Chief Executive of the Association of Plastic Recyclers. The recyclers are excited to be here today. Thank you for giving the recyclers the opportunity to address you. APR is the voice of plastic recyclers. We are the boots on the ground dedicated to making recycling work every day across the United States. We work at every link of the chain, from the initial design of packaging to eventual manufacturing. Our design guide for plastics recyclability and our testing protocols are the gold standard and referenced across the globe. They have been adopted by thousands of companies, countries, organizations as the technical basis to ensure that plastics packaging is designed to be recycled from the very beginning. Our member companies take your soda bottles, your milk jugs, your yogurt containers from every community recycling program. We wash them, we grind them, we flake them, we make pellets that we then sell to U.S. manufacturers who make them into new plastic packaging and products. Last year, our members completed this cycle countless times, recycling more than 5 billion pounds of post-consumer plastics. That's 5 billion pounds of plastic that did not end up in the ocean or in a landfill. Plastics recycling, particularly for consumer plastics packaging, works. But as we all know, it can work a lot better. The problems facing our recycling infrastructure today, however, are not just in plastics. We know that 3 out of every 5 cardboard boxes and half of the aluminum cans are thrown away by U.S. households every year. But my focus with you today is on plastics recycling. And I'd like to share some numbers, if you don't mind, and I'll try and keep this as straightforward as I can. 80% of consumer packaging is comprised of 3 resins. PET, which is soda bottle resin that we're talking about here today, high-density polyethylene, which are your milk jugs, your laundry detergent, and polypropylene, which is yogurt tubs, butter tubs, what have you. 80% of consumer packaging are in those 3 forms. Right now, we recycle those 3 forms in the United States at 19.8%. It's not very good. Interesting, our members have the capacity today, September 29th, 2023, to take that number to 42% tomorrow, if in fact we could get the supply. Recyclers simply can't recycle what is not made available to recycle. So collection, supply is a huge problem facing this industry because we have the ability to deal with it and to recycle it, even as we sit here today. We know that recycling matters, not just to reduce waste and protect our environment, but also as the economic engine for U.S. manufacturing and building clean, resilient domestic supply chains. Demand for our products' recycled content is soaring. U.S. companies have committed to buying 3 times more soda bottle resin by 2025 than is currently available in the domestic market. As a result, our members are already importing plastics from other countries to meet that demand. Collecting more recyclable plastics is good for U.S. consumers, U.S. manufacturing, and clearly benefits our environment. We need to collect more plastics from consumers, but the responsibility cannot and must not fall on consumers alone. We need robust public policies at the state and federal level to grow and sustain recycling. Plastics recycling is a very complex, interconnected system, and there's no silver bullet fix. Instead, we need a comprehensive suite of tools at every link in the chain, and our focus right now is on 3 main suggestions for you. First, plastics must be designed to be recyclable. If they're not designed to be recyclable, it doesn't matter if we collect it, we sort it, we process it, it's going to contaminate the stream. It includes manufacturing adherence to design standards and implementation of very clear, consistent labeling so we don't confuse consumers in terms of what to put in the bin. Second, recycling must be convenient and accessible. We need more bins at every household and business in the state. Frankly, we need to make recycling as simple as throwing away a container. We have 9,000 recycling programs in this country. Most of them take something different. We do a great job at confusing the consumer. And third, new plastics packaging must be made out of recycled plastic through U.S. manufacturing. APR was the first organization to call for mandatory recycled content standards back nearly 20 years ago in 2006. We still need state and federal policies to drive minimum recycled content standards. Americans across the board support recycling. So long as people depend on plastics, we need a robust recycling supply chain to minimize that waste and to strengthen sustainability. Recycling is the sustainability solution for plastics packaging. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the recyclers. I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much to each of you bringing your diverse set of skills and experiences to bear here. I want to start with you, Mr. Alexander, and kind of understanding this plastics piece better. You mentioned that there are three types of plastic that are common in food containers: PET, high-density polyurethane, no,
Polyethylene.
polyethylene, and polypropylene.
Yes, sir.
Basically corresponding to water bottles, milk jugs, and yogurt cups, crudely.
Yeah.
And so did you say that 80% of the containers fall into one of those three categories?
Of consumer packaging, right, 80% of the rigid consumer packaging, not film and flexibles. The rigid consumer packaging falls into one of those three categories. Yes, sir.
Is there an effective recycling path? You mentioned the wash, grind, flake, pellet path. Does that same path work for all three of these plastics?
Yes, it does.
And can they be mixed together, or you have to keep separate each of those streams?
Senator, they don't like each other. So, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be flip.
No.
So, soda bottle resin, basically each stream has to be homogeneous. Soda bottle resin, and again, is called polyethylene terephthalate. That's one. High-density polyethylene, low-density polyethylene, polypropylene. There can be a little bit of mix, depending on the application. You might have 5% mix, 10% mix, but again, it depends on the application. But by and large, you need a very clean, pristine, homogeneous stream, and that's why plastics needs to be sorted appropriately.
So you mentioned how confused people are about what can be recycled, what can go in the bin. I experience this every single week, staring at the triangles, wondering if these triangles are accepted, and so forth. But so we need a simpler system. But can you explain just briefly? Ordinary folks like myself kind of go, why these three different types of plastic? For these three different types of products that have to do with the chemical interactions with different types of yogurt versus water versus soda, or why aren't they all made from the same type, which would make it simpler in terms of commingling the streams?
It really has to do on the application and the chemical composition of each of the individual resins. It's really to protect the material, the contents of the container. For instance, you see a lot of milk jugs, have a natural color to them. That's to protect it from light and from spoiling, things like that. It also, in terms of the way that, you can't put, for instance, yogurt in the same container as a single-use water bottle. The material will spoil much quickly. It's about preservation of the material. It's interesting, it would be much simpler if we could do that, and it would be much less expensive for the packaging companies and the recyclers to be able to do that. But unfortunately, the protection of the product lends itself to a particular type of protective package delivery system.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you. And more or less, it's equally simple to wash, grind, flake, and pellet, each three. There's when you produce those pellets from these different plastics, there's a market for those. And I think you were referring to how if more was recycled, there'd be a ready market for an expanded flow of plastics.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned that one of the things that could drive this is recycled content standards. What do we have currently? Do we have any are there voluntary suggestions? Do any states have a standard? Or is there any national standard?
There aren't any national standards either from design or recycled content mandates nationally. There is some effort. The state of California has a recycled content mandate. for beverage containers that is due to go into effect in 2025, and that it gets progressively more from 25% to 35% to 50%. There is discussion in the state of Oregon and in the state of Washington right now about developing recycled content mandates along with recycling rate mandates. We're working very, very closely with them. The issue there is you need to make sure you have the supply available in order to meet those contents. Like, for instance, in California, we did a study for them 3 years ago on the 25% recycling rate, the recycled content rate, and we told them that we have enough material in our stream to get them to 25%, but anything beyond that, we need to collect more material. So right now, there's enough in the process to get us to 25%.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Chair of the Committees, Senator Carper. So glad you could join us. Welcome.
This is great. Now I can talk out of both sides of my mouth. How's that? That's what they let chairmen do around here. Well, let me just say on a serious note, welcome. Ms. Collins, you look just like your pictures of the senator from Maine, and who's one of our revered colleagues. I don't know if have you ever met Senator Susan Collins?
I've been in her office.
Well, did you meet her? Did you meet her?
No, I didn't. I didn't get a chance to meet her. I met with her staff.
When you went into her office, did you tell her staff that you were the real Susan Collins?
I told them I was the other Susan Collins.
Well, you've got a good name. It's a good name around here. All right. Well, we're happy here. We've got a couple of other hearings going on. We've got a bunch of folks from the IRS nominees to help run the IRS and provide better customer service. That's going on in the Finance Committee. So I got to go bouncing back and forth between here and there. Let me see, Mr. Bailey. It's really nice to see you. Mr. Alexander, nice to see you as well. And Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for pulling us together for what I think is a real important hearing. I'm 76 years old. Started recycling when I was, I think, a Lieutenant JG in the Navy. My squadron was located in Moffett Field, California, not far from Palo Alto and Menlo Park. And I learned that when I was just joining my squadron that there's a place you could recycle, and not far from the base. And I started going there when I was just a young pup, and I have never stopped. I've recycled entire vehicles, motor vehicles, like our Ford Exploder, also known as the Ford Explorer. Recycled dehumidifiers. I like to run. I like to run outside, and when I see recyclables along the trail, I stop and I pick them up and I take them with me, and I run by other people's houses, and if they have the recycling bin out, I just put it in the recycling bin. This morning I was on the Amtrak train coming down from Delaware. I go back and forth most days, and I was in the cafe car getting a cup of coffee, and a guy came in and he had a plastic bottle and he was going to put it in the trash. And before he could do that, I intercepted him. I took the bottle, and I said, on Amtrak, we recycle. And like 2 feet away was the recycling bin. So I believe in leadership by example. And I know Senator Merkley and I share this passion. I'm certain that you do as well. I like to say, when I talk to people about climate change and the need to save this planet, I say, well, it's not just a noble thing to do. It's actually, in terms of jobs and job creation, it's the smart thing to do. And with respect to recycling, not only does it give us the opportunity to strike a blow for against the climate crisis, but also gives us the opportunity to create a lot of jobs for a whole lot of people in places throughout our country. And with that having been said, good morning, Sheldon. We're following each other from committee to committee. We do that fairly regularly. But would you expand on the role of a national deposit return system and how it could play in a role it could play in reducing emissions in fighting climate crisis, please?
Well, thank you for that question. So we talked about the greenhouse gas savings equivalent to taking 1.8 million cars off the road, but many people...
Over what period of time?
over each year. Each year, the containers would be recycled, and that's the number of cars operating in that year that it would be equivalent to. Most people don't realize how our common materials are created. There's no need for us to. We just use plastic bottles and aluminum cans and glass bottles. But a tremendous amount of material has to be mined to create those materials, and it has to go through several industrial processes and then transported, sometimes great distances across the world. Like our aluminum can come from many different countries, close, Jamaica, far, Russia, So all of that, all of those industrial processes, all of that transportation becomes part of the embodied energy of something like an aluminum can or a glass bottle. When we recycle, we skip the first several steps of production. We skip all of that industrial mining and transportation and just take what has already been produced, melt it down, and produce it again. And so that's why we save so much in greenhouse gases. And most people don't realize that there's a very big front-end burden of greenhouse gases on the manufacturing of our materials.
All right, that was a great explanation, I think. Mr. Alexander, we also heard from you, I believe, maybe just before I arrived, that the mechanical recycling of plastic materials, as opposed to the use of new resins created through a chemical recycling process, is better for our planet. And would you please share with us how your industry could help curb emissions and reduce energy consumption? Mr. Alexander.
Thank you, Senator. Am I on? I'm on.
You're on.
Thanks.
Live and in person.
Most times I don't need a microphone. So recycling plastic is one of the most important things we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The energy consumption in order to use recycled plastics to remanufacture saves anywhere between 75 and 85% of the energy, as Susan was talking about, to manufacture virgin materials. Secondly, using recycled plastic to remanufacture reduces carbon footprint by more than 70%. It's interesting that there have been studies that have shown that in this world of climate change, one of the most effective things that can be done by a consumer to physically participate in reducing their own carbon footprint is to recycle their plastic. And so the more material that we recycle, obviously, if you think about it, we're replacing more virgin material in the marketplace, which means we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions from that initial manufacturing process that Susan just chatted about as well. So when we talk about we need more supply so that we can recycle more of this material, so that we can replace more of the virgin material that's going into the marketplace, that in by itself is a great reducer of greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint implications.
Let me follow up. Thank you for that response. But is your industry currently recycling plastic material at its full capacity, or would increased resources and infrastructure allow you and your industry to recycle more plastic? And the second half of my question would be, would the improved ability to mechanically recycle more plastic lead to additional climate benefits? Two-part question.
Well, to the second part, to refer to my first answer, absolutely. I mean, the more you recycle, the more we're going to be reducing our climate impact and our greenhouse gas emissions. I indicated earlier in my statement, Senator, that right now the three primary resin components of consumer packaging, which make up 80% of consumer packaging, we recycle those three components at a 19.8%, but we have the capacity today to make that 42%. We need more supply. It's as simple as that. And so the more supply we can get, the more we can recycle, the more virgin resin we can eliminate in the marketplace. And then, of course, that in fact has the effect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and our carbon footprint.
All right, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Will there be a second round of questions?
Absolutely.
Okay,
and
thank you.
Third and fourth, maybe.
I won't be around for the fourth, but thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you particularly for your persistent interest and concern about the plastics issue. On plastics recycling, I try to be a good citizen. I've got the recycling bins under the kitchen table, and I try to be diligent about making sure that I rinse out the bottles and put them in the bin, and at the right time of the week, hike them down to the outside bin and dump them in the outside bin, and then roll the outside bin down to the street where then the recycling truck comes to pick it all up. And I'm also working with Senator Sullivan on our plastics legislation, and we're looking at now, it'll be Save Our Seas 3.0, and as part of that inquiry, I'm looking more into plastics recycling. And what I'm learning is that it really isn't happening. That the stuff that I actually take and put in my blue bin, the amount of the stuff that actually gets put in the blue bin, setting aside the stuff that, you know, gets thrown away, discarded improperly, et cetera, from the blue bin, the amount that actually gets recycled is in single digits. Most of it isn't recycled at all. And it more and more makes that blue bin in my kitchen look to me like a prop that is a prop in an essentially fraudulent scheme to make American consumers think that they can buy all the plastic they want for as long as they want because there is a legitimate recycling end to it. They can feel better about it and keep buying the bottles, keep buying the packaging, keep throwing them in the bins, keep thinking that it's going to be recycled. And it's not. It's a fake, more than 90% of the time. And consumers are the suckers in all of that, and taxpayers are the suckers in all of that because the recycling programs that propagate this mythology of plastics recycling are paid for by taxpayers. So I've gone from feeling good about putting my plastics away as I've done my research into thinking that I'm basically been co-opted into a big fat scam that makes people believe there's recycling when there really isn't. And if you look at the other end, on the plastics industry side, and you look at what the plastics industry is doing to bring recycling into its products, the number that I recall is that for single-use plastics, the component of plastic input that is recycled is less than 2%. I mean, they're not even trying. You could probably get 2% by accident. So there's really no effort. And when I ask, why is there really no effort, they say, well, because it's actually more expensive for us to go and find and test and have a proper supply chain for recycled plastic than it is for us just to get the new nurdles and spread more and more and more and more plastic into our ecosystem. It's cheaper to not use recycled plastic, so guess what? They don't use recycled plastic. And when I tried to fix that by putting a little charge on virgin plastic destined for single-use plastic products so that it would equilibrate, so that there'd be equivalency in the cost to the industry of recycled plastic and new plastic, I got virtually berserk industry opposition. Pages in newspapers with pictures of child seats and bicycle helmets saying that, you know, Congress wanted to tax your child seat and your bicycle helmet. Last I heard, child seats aren't single use. Last I heard, bicycle helmets aren't single use. So we have this system in which the public is being fooled. The industry is not being helpful at providing any significant recycling support. And when you try to equilibrate the economic imperatives that they follow, they fight you on it. So that's where I think we are on recycling. And I've essentially burned through all my time, but I offer any of the three of you the opportunity to respond in a response for the record. If you think I've said something that is outlandish or wrong, or I've got my facts not right, then feel free to let me know. But what I'm left with is that I feel like I've been the sucker in a con job, and that a lot of taxpayers are paying a lot of money to prop up a completely phony or almost completely phony recycling apparatus that reaches into kitchens and garages all around the country and has as its primary purpose misleading people about where their plastic ends up and therefore encouraging them to, guess what, buy more plastic. With that, I yield.
Well, Senator, I think it'd be useful in this dialogue, and we have the time to do so. We have certainly the wish cycling, which is a term used for putting your things in those buckets that is never going to be recycled. But in the bottle recycling, it may be a little bit of a different picture than the non-bottle world. And we've got experts on the bottle world, so would it be useful to have them share their insights? No, I'm yielding the committee's time to you.
Anybody wishes to comment?
I might jump in. Senator, I think as I talk to people, my friends and neighbors, a lot of them share a similar frustration to what you are expressing. And there is a perception that they are unsure what's happening to the material that's going into the blue bin on the side of their house that they're pulling out to the curb. They want to recycle, they want to do the right thing, but they just don't know. And Senator Merkley, to an earlier point that you made, it is very confusing when we try to talk to busy people about recycling and tell them, well, you got to separate this and you got to do that and you got to figure this out or clean this or pull this off the top. It's hard. And frankly, with 2 young kids at home, I feel the pain, right? I'm just busy trying to get dinner on the table. But that's where deposit return systems provide a really clear economic incentive. It says, hey, this has a value associated with it. This is easily recyclable. And if you return it, you get your value back, and it is segregated out from the other things. So you don't have your water bottle mixed up with your detergent bottle, even if they're the same type of plastic, all blended together, mixed in together with whatever people also throw in the blue bin, which is often recyclable or not, depending on the wish cycling that you brought up. The good news is that I can guarantee you, Senator, that when a beverage container is redeemed through a deposit return system, and it's not just ours, I would say this is true for any of the deposit return systems across the country, it is recycled. It is recycled, and it is recycled to its highest and best use. So in Oregon, we get back nearly 90% of all bottles and cans sold in the state, and 100% of those bottles that are plastic go to a wash and flake facility in St. Helens, Oregon, in rural Oregon.
So by putting a reward on return, you're able to essentially flip the numbers from 90% of the plastic not being recycled and just ending up in a dump someplace in the US or in some foreign country or ultimately in a river and in the ocean, to where 90% of it actually gets claimed and used.
That's correct, Senator, yes.
Well, that's a very helpful signal about the importance of what we would call bottle bills. I can relate to you that every time I see a bottle bill turn up, the plastics and drinks industry goes berserk, trying to make sure that it doesn't pass into law. So bravo getting it passed into law. I assume you had the same experience with opposition from industry. And I'll close out by saying you can actually do this at the more corporate level as well. I was in Oslo at the Our Oceans conference when Unilever made what I thought was a very impressive commitment, which is about, I think, to go live, if I remember the timing, that for every, this was Oslo, so let me say kilo, for every kilo of plastic that Unilever put out into the world as packaging or whatever came through them and out into the world, they would go find a kilo of plastic waste and take it back out of the world and assure its proper disposal or recycling, which did something significant, and that is, again, economics driving all of this. Now they have to buy that stuff. So suddenly, there's a market, particularly to go to poor countries where this stuff is piled up. You see these horrible photos of countries where it's, shin deep along the beach and 50 yards out into the water, just a mass of floating plastic waste. Now, Unilever has an incentive to pay somebody to go out and get that stuff and bring it back to them and have a solid, we're actually cleaning up the waste supply chain to prove out their promise. And I think that can make a very, very big difference. I think at the end of the day, it's enormously about economic incentives. It is almost unfair to corporations to expect them to behave in a manner that is inconsistent with their economic interests. So it really is incumbent on us to make sure that their economic interests align with the public interest. Otherwise, it's always going to be an uphill struggle, and the ones who want to cheat the most will have the best economic advantage against the ones who try to be good citizens. So thanks again for holding the hearing.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your work on plastics, so important. Ms. Collins, let's turn to one point that Senator Whitehouse raised. When the materials are flaked, if you will, and turned into pellets, so they're washed, they're ground, they're flaked, and they're turned into pellets, is that material cheaper to the industry than virgin material for making new plastic bottles?
Thank you for the question. It totally depends on what's happening in the marketplace and what the price of oil is. Virgin prices go up and down dramatically. So sometimes virgin material is cheaper, sometimes recycled content is cheaper. I'll add that the recycled content laws in the different states, especially I'll speak to the one in California, attempts to impose an economic incentive to use recycled content by placing a 20-cent per pound penalty on material that's used that is virgin material instead. So it's an economic mechanism to try to even out the price differential, because sometimes recycled content is cheaper for plastic and sometimes it's more expensive.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn, Mr. Alexander, this is your world. How do we make sure that the economics work for the recycled plastic that you were noting could be greatly expanded if we had more of it?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and if you don't mind, I'd also like to address some of the comments that the Senator Whitehouse made. I think one of the things that we find in this industry, and not to get too technical, this industry tends to operate on a month-to-month, short-term purchasing basis. One of the things that we've been pushing very aggressively in our market is for recyclers to be able to obtain long-term contracts with converters and consumer brand companies to use the material in their packaging. Because in point of fact, right now, we're played against the virgin market. On a month-to-month basis, if recycled resin, the additionality of recycling the material is somehow consistent with virgin material, then we can sell it. In others, when virgin prices plummet, then they get out of the market and they go to the cheaper product. So it's a lot of it's a procurement issue that we're working. That's why with long-term contracts and with mandated content requirements, if the companies have to use content, then they know that they're going to have to use it, so that then we can have a stable economic environment. We know we're going to have a market. We can price it accordingly for the longer term, which then allows us to pay the supplier, the MRFs, a better price in order to make their bales of material more pristine, which reduces our operating costs, which reduces the cost of the product.
So recycled content standards and long-term
Contracts are critical.
Okay, thank you. I'm not going to ask you to respond to all of Senator Whitehouse's broader vision because of the limited time, but we may have time at the end to come back to it.
Okay, great.
I wanted to turn, starting to amplify a little bit of the details.
Could I ask a favor? I have limited time to get back to the Finance Committee.
Oh, absolutely,
and ask a
Mr.
question,
Chairman.
if you don't mind.
Please.
Thanks so much. Ms. Collins, a question, if I could, for you. I think in your testimony you mentioned that deposit return systems in the U.S. currently create over 20,000 jobs. Is that right?
Yes.
And your organization estimates that a national bottle bill could create an additional 80,000 jobs for a total of 100,000 jobs. Not a bad, that's kind of a win-win situation where I come from. Would you share with us a little more information on how deposit return systems increase employment rates and contribute to economic growth? And what are some specific jobs associated with deposit return systems, please?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. We conducted a study about 10 years ago where we looked very deeply at the entire process of recycling and looked industry by industry and got factors for the jobs per 1,000 tons of materials moved. The number one reason that container deposit laws create more jobs is because there's more material in the recycling system. It's because instead of operating at something like 20 or 30% recycling rates, they're actually bringing back more material, and that material has to be handled by people doing the recycling process. And when I say the recycling process, it starts all the way from the beginning where the materials are collected, and then they are transported to places like glass beneficiation facilities where the glass is cleaned up so that it can be used by manufacturers, or to plastic reclaimers, where they're taking that material and turning it into plastic pellets that can then be made into bottles again. All of those places are jobs, and some of them are, highly valued, highly paid manufacturing jobs. And they're domestic. They all stay here in the United States. So those are the numbers we found. It would be an additional 80,000 jobs, and those are the types of jobs that they are.
Good. Thanks for that response. Mr. Alexander, before I run, one last question, if I could, for you. In the EPA's draft strategy to address plastic pollution, you may have noticed that the agency affirmed it doesn't consider activities that convert non-hazardous solid waste, such as plastics, into fuels to be recycling activities. That's the way they call it. Question, do you agree with the statement that any process that takes plastic materials and converts it into a fuel source using incineration, pyrolysis, chemical reactions, or otherwise should not be considered recycling?
That's correct. If it's not going back into plastics, we don't consider it recycling.
All right. Would you please explain the main difference between mechanical recycling and the process often referred to as advanced or chemical recycling, including energy use, emissions, or scalability?
Okay, well, essentially, like when Susan pointed out earlier, the initial process for manufacturing the material, but also the initial process for segregating and recycling the material, mechanical recycling, chemical recycling, the initial process is similar. You have to collect the material, you have to sort it, and then you have to begin to process it. And in many ways, it has to be mechanically processed for a while and then make it available if, in fact, there is a chemical process for it. Mechanical processes are exactly what we talked about. You're physically, mechanically grinding, flaking, pelletizing. The chemical process, the best I understand it, and I'm not a chemist, is that what you do is you then take that material and through some combination of heat and pressure, break down to the original monomer. So you're actually breaking the material down. That's technology that's obviously been discussed. I think there may be an opportunity for that because we need new technologies in order to address a lot of the plastic products that are out there. But what we know how to do and what we're doing today, is a proven recycling activity, which is mechanical recycling. And frankly, if we have more supply, we have more content requirements, and we have, more convenience, we can improve and reduce greenhouse gases more by just reinforcing and prioritizing what we're already doing today.
Thank you for those responses, Mr. Chairman. Before I run out of the room, I just received from my staff. I said, what percentage of our paper are we currently recycling in America? And the number I knew was pretty high. It's about 68%. I think this is an EPA number. And with respect to aluminum, about 35%. Not as high as paper, but that's an EPA number. Is that right? Yeah, that's from EPA. We're told in 2018, EPA estimated that paper recycling was at, and aluminum rate was at, for plastic, what is it, 9%? Yeah, 9%. I like to say, Mr. Chairman, find out what works, do more of that. Find out what works, do more of that. And obviously, we're doing in the papers. There's plenty of supply, if you will, for that in terms of recycling. We can do better. We got to do better than we're doing, and hopefully part of that's the solution. Part of the answer, the path forward, will come from this hearing and your leadership. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much, Chairman Carper, and I think that 9% rate may have dropped this last couple years, if any of our experts have a sense of that, but I thought it had dropped down to closer to 6% in the last year.
Mr. Chair, may I address that?
Sure. Briefly, though, please.
That's always a challenge. The reality is that number, we hear it all the time, relative to consumer plastics packaging, that number is wrong. That takes in all plastics that are manufactured. Primarily what we're addressing here is consumer packaging. More than 50% of the plastic that is manufactured is not meant for consumer curbside recycling programs. You're talking medical waste, you're talking automobile parts, you're talking fiber, you're talking electronics. You take away that half, and what we're doing is we're focusing our consumer recycling on the other essentially 50%. And as I indicated to you earlier, eight of every 10 of those packages in that 50% category of consumer packaging is we're doing that at 20% today, and we can get it to 42%. So when you talk about that 8% number, frankly, it drives us recyclers batty, okay? And the other thing I'd like to say is we know, this is what we do every day, something goes in your bin, it gets recycled at a 70% rate. I don't know where that narrative comes from, that if it goes in your bin, it's not recycled or at a low level. We know. We've been doing studies. We've been doing this for 35 years. It goes in your bin, 70% is going to get recycled.
Thank you for that clarification. I want to turn to some of the details of the Oregon program, since it's one of the, well, in our estimation, the most successful in the country. It's gone through a number of changes. And Mr. Bailey, 20 years ago, people returned their bottles to the grocery store. Grocery stores didn't really love that very much. And now Oregon has changed its system. Can you explain that transition?
Absolutely, Senator. So what's happened over time, and it was in the graph that I showed earlier, is people have voted with their feet, and they prefer an option that is more convenient. And the trick is to have multiple return pathways. So under the reforms that were shepherded in the mid-2000s, we started opening redemption centers that are high-capacity redemption centers, people that want to get back their cash and return a lot of containers all at once, which there are a number of people that do that. They like going to those redemption centers better than going to a grocery store because they can return their containers faster. We have high volume, high capacity machines. They get their cash more quickly. It's a better return experience overall. But then we've also created what's called the Green Bag program, which is really convenient for families. And essentially, Senator Whitehouse mentioned the bin he had under his sink. In my family, we have garbage, we have recycling, and then we have redemption. And compost is up on the top there. But and then redemption is easy. We just put our green bag in there. We throw all our containers mixed. We don't have to separate glass, metal, plastic. And then when we go to any of the drop sites, sometimes they're at a grocery store, sometimes they're at a redemption center, we just drop the bag in and walk away. And then OBRC picks it up, processes it, credits to your account, and makes it super simple. What we have seen is that that is the most popular option that Oregonians want, and the demand for that is astronomical.
So I'm going to pause you there and just explain for folks who are watching that under this green bag system, and you had a picture of it up on the screen. I don't know if we can put up the person who was returning their green and a blue bag, which I'll get to in a moment. But essentially, in our family, we have the green bag out in the garage, and we throw everything that has a redemption into it, large bottles, small bottles, so on and so forth. And then it has a quick response code that you put on the package. And so you just go to the redemption center, you throw it through the door, and then it gets transported to a processing center where the bags are opened, the bottles are scattered across a tray, a computer takes a picture of them, immediately recognizes what's all recyclable, and credits your account. And it's pretty much science fiction, and I encourage people to visit and see it. But you also, in that picture, had a blue bag being returned. What is the difference between a green bag and a blue bag?
So blue bag indicates that that is a bag that will be automatically credited to a certified nonprofit. So if you put your containers in a blue bag, you know that that is, we have verified that's a 501c3. So for example, my kid's school has rolls of blue bags, and when we go pick the kids up, they say, have you got your blue bag yet? And they hand us one. And then when we go home, we put the containers into the blue bag, and then when we drop that off, the money automatically goes to that nonprofit. So we have 5,600 nonprofits in the state of Oregon registered for blue bags.
So every Habitat for Humanity, food bank, school club, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, you name it, 5,600 of them are saying, hey, you're involved in this swim club, put our QR codes on a blue bag, and it'll be a fundraiser. And that creates an additional large incentive for recycling.
That's right. And Senator, I think the really important point here that you're driving at is there are so many things that pull people into the program to care about redeeming containers. They might not care about the environment. The 10 cents might not mean a lot to them. Maybe they've got other things going on. But you know what? If their local sportsman's club or their kid's school puts a blue bag in their hand and says, will you put some containers in there and drop it off for us? Then yeah, they're going to do that, right? And that's one of the reasons the redemption rate is so high in Oregon.
I really want to emphasize in your testimony, you talked about convenience and incentives. So the blue bag is a whole nother set of incentives that encourage recycling. And it's convenient because you just throw the bag through the door, and then it all happens automatically. I wanted to turn to the incentive rate in Oregon is 10 cents. Mm-hmm. Now, if we go back to the initial program in Oregon, it was 5 cents. 5 cents today would be, we used to say it would be more than 25 cents, but now I'm sure it's be higher. It was like, oh yeah, I noticed as I was in Boy Scouts at the time, and we'd go up and clean up the river along the Columbia River or the beach, and suddenly all the bottles disappeared overnight. All of the glass bottles that would be shattered and broken disappeared overnight. What would that 5 cents be today?
It feels like every year we have to do the calculation again, so I think we're over 30 cents or 33 cents now. But the change when we went from a nickel to a dime in 2017 was remarkable. Oregon's system was struggling, and thanks to the reforms that were shepherded through the legislature, we went from a nickel to a dime in 2017, and literally overnight, we went from essentially an annualized rate of about 64%, but it had really dropped down to about 58% by the time it changed, all the way up to 84% overnight, and then continued to climb to 90%, right? So it has made a dramatic difference.
So, Ms. Collins, some states have on certain types of bottles a 15-cent reduction. Is there insights that come from studying the 5 versus a 10 versus a 15, the magical point at which people stop and pick up bottles that somebody else has left on the street?
Absolutely. We've studied this both in the United States and around the world. And here in the United States, there's 3 levels of deposit. There are states that are all at 5 cents. There are states that are all at 10 cents. And then there are a few states that have some containers at a higher level and some containers at 5 cents. And those different deposits, when you compile all of the information together, it stacks up exactly how you would think it was. 5 cents is an incentive. 10 cents is a stronger incentive. The 5-cent programs have lower redemption rates than the 10-cent programs. And we see that it goes all the way up to 25 euro cents in Germany, which has one of the highest redemption rates in the world at between 95 and 100%.
So do you have, since we don't have a national system, if you have a state that has a 15% return, 15 cents return, do you find people basically transporting bottles across state lines, and does that undermine the system, or is that just an additional beneficial collection process?
It depends on your point of view. There are containers that move across the border, and they are generally in the range that is less than 5% of the total system. So they're sort of offsetting the folks who aren't in the given state that are returning their containers. You know, there's 10 to 15% of those, even in the best systems, and then there's some leakage from another state into your state. So it's not a make or break situation, but it does occur.
Do the containers in states that are far from a deposit state, Are they labeled returnable in those other states, or are they not labeled that way?
There are some containers that are labeled differently. In the Northeast, where it did get to be enough of a problem, some of the beverage manufacturers changed their labeling to make it very clear whether that container was a deposit state container or a non-deposit state container. So when it did reach a certain threshold of a problem, there was a way to address it. But in the vast majority of cases, the containers are labeled identically, so you wouldn't know from state to state.
Mr. Bailey, let's go to some of the other economics here. How much taxpayer money goes into driving the recycling system in Oregon?
None, Senator. We don't take any public money.
All the Republicans who are present here and the Democrats who are present like that answer.
It's paid for by the beverage industry, Senator. And one other point I might just make very briefly on the point of the nickel to the dime change. When we went from a nickel to a dime, while I won't comment on any particular beverage seller, I can tell you in aggregate, per capita sales did not change in Oregon.
So we do not see a disincentive to purchase.
We have not seen that in the data, Senator.
Because of that. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the different types of plastics that are in beverage bottles. So under the Oregon system, the return deposit, I'm assuming there are several different types of plastic that are coming in through these green bags, blue bags, yellow bins, so on and so forth. And so how do you sort them out to keep these waste streams separate the way Mr. Alexander was explaining, that each one has to have a separate, if you will, wash, grind, flake, and pellet process?
Yes, Senator, I'll try to make this brief because there's sort of an interesting longer answer here, but I'll see if I can condense. Most beverage packaging is in PET. There is some HDPE in our system. There is some polypropylene and a few other things. Vast majority is in PET, although the caps on PET are polypropylene. We urge people to leave the caps on. We recycle those as well. Please leave the cap on your container when you return it. And as long as it's all beverage containers, it's actually pretty easy to separate out the different material types. It goes baled in bulk to our sister facility, ORPET, in St. Helens, and there's different weights to the plastic. So if you run it into water, the PET will sink, and then the other material will float, and you can skim it off. It's not very difficult to do it. If you had to do it at scale and there was a ton of different plastic types mixed in together, it would definitely get much more difficult to do that, and you could risk other contamination. As an example, and one of the reasons that having a industry-run program has been very powerful is we had a beverage manufacturer, I won't say who came in to our market wanting to sell a container that was made of a plastic type that, to use a technical term, would have screwed up the recycling of all the rest of the plastic that we had. And we went to them and we said, well, hey, we can't stop you from selling this in the state of Oregon, but we're going to have to pull that out by hand and separate it out, and that's going to be very expensive in the system. And so our fee to you to do that, to sell that in Oregon, is going to be astronomical. Do you want to sell this in the state or not? And they said, yeah, actually, you know what, never mind. We won't sell that package in the state of Oregon because it's not really recyclable.
So the materials of the bottles that have the deposit are mostly PET. Do you call it PET or PET?
It depends on, it's potato.
Okay. And high-density polyethylene.
Mm-hmm.
And so what are the percents on that? Is it like 80% PET?
It's higher than that, yeah.
And so those are the main two?
Yes, it's primarily PET and HDPE. We do have some polypropylene package in there, but it's de minimis.
How do you get that out? So the high-density sinks, the PET floats. That's easy.
Polypropylene floats as well too, and then we also have sorters in our wash and flake facility that use optical sorting. It's actually really cool. Speaking of magic, I know how the AI works for our green bags. That's not magic to me anymore, but the sorters are still magic to me, and they can see opacity within the different flake types, and they can shoot them off with these little air jets at really high speed and get those things sorted.
All right, so it goes down a conveyor belt and it gets knocked off.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not a problem is my point in this.
Not within the beverage container world. You wouldn't want, again, to repeat, you wouldn't want non-food grade with food grade mixed together, because then you have two polymer types that are the same and would be hard to distinguish in that zinc float or in the polymer sorting, opacity sorting. It would look the same, but there is a big difference in the chemical composition between something that's food grade and not.
So these pellets of these different types is, going back to the economics of how we drive this, who is it sold then by this, you all sell these pellets?
Yeah, we co-own the wash and flake facility. We then sell the flake. Some of that goes into pellets through another company. We don't market the pellets directly, but we do have flake. And to echo Mr. Alexander's point, we have a problem with demand and having that pull through of need for recycled content, of long-term contracts. That would go a long ways towards making these kinds of facilities much more viable. But then they would, of course, need at scale to be supplied with as much material as they can handle.
So is the key, I think Mr. Alexander noted, a key piece is a recycled content standard or requirement. Is that what you need to drive the demand?
We don't have a specific position on recycled content standards, but what we have seen is that recycled content standards have been a major motivator. And to Senator Whitehouse's earlier comment about industry, it's one of the reasons that we've seen industry come around to support these kinds of programs, because they need clean supply to then meet those standards.
Okay. So what do you do if you can't market it? Or do you just lower your price in order to get it out of the warehouse?
Supply and demand, prices are low. Yep.
Okay. So
if anybody wants to buy it, they can call me.
Okay, very good. And Ms. Collins, as we look across the landscape, is this I think most of the plastics that we're talking about are made with fossil gas, and fracking has made fossil gas a lot cheaper. So are we in a situation where that's made it difficult to sell from the different systems around the country, difficult to kind of get rid of the recycled material?
Well, again, there is a difference between food-grade material and non-food-grade material. So historically, the materials, specifically plastic, specifically PET plastic through bottle bills, has always experienced a stronger position in the marketplace. It's very high-quality food-grade material. So when there have been times historically where it was hard to sell material, it was easier to sell the bottle bill material, and it was the curbside lower-grade material that had to wait longer to find a home.
Okay. So we used to ship a lot of bulk plastic waste to China, and that ended. China said, no, we're not taking this anymore. Do we ship anything out of the country now, or is it all stay here? I know this is broader than consumer plastics or food plastics, but...
Senator, I'll let the others speak more broadly. I will just say for the system we run, no material is shipped out. Most of the material is recycled within the state, and it's certainly, when you include the aluminum, is all recycled domestically.
Senator, export of material has been going down since 2005 as the market escalated for the demand, and then obviously with the China sword in 2017 and 18, the infrastructure has essentially absorbed most of that material, and as I indicated in my testimony, we're importing material to try and meet the demand for recycled content, both food and non-food grade applications.
Mr. Alexander, is it a challenge to make sure that the imported material is actually what you think it is? I guess I'll put it that way.
The challenge arises as to whether or not it's, and we have certificates of origin. First of all, food-grade material, to sell food-grade material in this country, you have to go through an FDA letter of non-objection. So you've got to have an LNO to sell that material. And it's a very elaborate, exhaustive, demanding process. And if a company has that, as Susan indicated and Jules said, they're in the gold standard, right? They're the highest priced in the marketplace. And so beyond that, you know, the other applications that can be utilized as barrier labels, filler, other products with PET in it. You know, what we're concerned about is it basically from consumer applications. And so we have certificates of origin that we use, so our members pretty much know that the material is coming from a consumer application, regardless of where it comes from. We do have some problem with some countries in terms of authenticity of certification. You might be able to guess who some of those are, but by and large, you know, where we get our material from, we pretty much are pretty confident that we know it's coming from a consumer application.
You know, my colleague mentioned one concern about establishing a deposit program, which is some of the, he mentioned that plastic has value in the trash stream or the waste stream, and that is currently sold and it's a source of funding, and as a deposit system, basically undermine the economics of the waste stream. Ms. Collins, can you address that?
Sure. What's important in answering a question like that is to make sure that you are looking at the whole issue and not just a very narrow piece of it. So the whole issue is the entire process of what a municipality or taxpayers pay for in terms of recycling. At the narrow point of just having a recycling facility that's selling that material, the PET plastic is valuable to them, the aluminum is valuable to them, and the glass oftentimes has a negative value because of the way that it's been broken and contaminated through the curbside recycling system. But when you go more broadly and ask a different question, which is, what is this municipality experiencing in terms of their total recycling costs? When container deposit systems are established, they save money. They don't have to pay for the landfilling of most of the material that is being landfilled and not recycled at all. They don't have to pay for the collection and processing. They have lower litter collection costs because these container deposit programs solve so many different problems for them. And this has been confirmed in literally more than 24 studies around the world.
Over the last 10 years, how many additional states have adopted a deposit program?
The last container deposit program entirely that was established in the United States was in the state of Hawaii in 2005, but there have been probably maybe 10 different updates to container deposit laws, updates and expansions in the states that do have them in the U.S.
And Washington State is considering a program, or other states on the verge of potentially establishing a deposit program?
Consistently since 2019, we've seen 9 or 10 states every year seriously consider these laws through having hearings in their legislatures.
So I'm going to wrap up with this question to you all, which is, just a bit of a story. Back when I was an intern here in 1976, that's a long time ago, Senator Hatfield presented a national bottle bill proposal on the floor of the Senate, so I went over to sit in on his speech. And when he was done and he lost the vote, both Senator Packwood and Senator Hatfield proposed a study at the same time, only Senator Hatfield had arranged to be called on, and to the chagrin of Senator Packwood from Oregon. We had a softball game that night, and I can tell you there was a lot of tension between the two Oregon teams over that. But the point here is that there's been a conversation now for half a century over whether a national structure makes sense. And my colleague, co-chair, ranking member Senator Mullen pointed out, different states may have different models that make sense. Different cultures are established, different consumer preferences. Is there a pathway for a national framework that would have some guidelines but also leave some flexibility to the states that could accomplish the goal that I heard from all of you of greatly expanding recycling with its various values of job creation, waste reduction, greenhouse gas reduction, and so forth? If you have a vision of how we might create a national framework that makes sense, any of you want to weigh in on that?
I'll jump in that really quickly, Senator, and I'm sure there are other comments here. You know, other than the fact that Oregon just joined the Big Ten, and there's not a whole lot of similarity between Oregon and Iowa, right? Or at least you wouldn't think so on the surface. Similarly, my wife's family is from Massachusetts, and sometimes I think they speak a foreign language. And so, hey, you know, I call it like I see it. But so, I mean, I think there are a lot of differences in various states, but what we've seen is that deposit return programs have worked in a lot of these different kinds of places around the country. And so, you know, I would actually take Ranking Member Mullen's point around one size fits all. I wouldn't think that a one size fits all program would work in the United States, but to set a North Star, to set a standard that says, here's what successful programs look like, and then to allow for state-based innovation and private sector innovation, I think has a lot of power and a lot of opportunity to eliminate some of the cross-border issues that we talked about, to generate more supply, to overcome some of the barriers that can crop up at the local level. And that is, I think, an appropriate place for federal policy to examine how we have a system that is flexible and can meet the needs of different constituencies.
I could just add that that's exactly how it has played out in Canada with all of their provinces, in Australia with their different states, and in the European Union through the European Union Directive.
And by played out, you mean that some countries in Europe had a program, but then it expanded in a broader vision. Did they use a few basic standards, and then each country in Europe is flexible within that? And same question about Canada. And any additional insights from those two structures?
Yes, they've all evolved in different ways. I'll use the European Union as an example. They had many countries that already had a deposit system in place ahead of time, and then they passed the Single-Use Plastics Directive, which mandated a 90% return rate for plastic bottles. And they have until 2030 or 2029 to do that. So one by one, the different countries that don't already have a system have been implementing new systems. So we anticipate that they'll all come online by 2030, but they've done it in their own individual way in each country.
Okay, again, state the basic requirements that drove that.
The most important one is just that they want a 90% collection rate for plastic bottles. That alone, that
Plastic
one sentence.
Beverage
Yes,
bottles.
yes,
Plastic
yes.
beverage
Thank you.
bottles. Okay. And Mr. Alexander, I've at one time the bottling world was deeply opposed to deposit systems. That was certainly true when Oregon originated this. I've started to kind of hear little bits of feelings like, well, maybe we are interested in a nationwide system with some parameters as interest grows about the amount of plastic waste that goes into landfills or ends up in rivers, ends up in the ocean, and so forth. Do you see kind of a shifting attitude and a possibility of creating a national framework?
Absolutely. We've experienced the same thing, particularly from the beverage industry, who are now working very closely with us. They need supply. And I think that, as Jules pointed out in terms of his testimony, that's a phenomenal program and the incentives that they have. We've learned a lot over the last 35 years in this endeavor, but it also points out that each state is its own marketplace. And, Vic Horton in Maine needs something different than Jules needs in Oregon, or Maya might need in Texas. But I think a national framework is certainly something. We need the supply. It's as simple as that.
So I picture things like the green bag, the blue bag, as the kind of details that states might pursue on their own, flexibility. But if we're thinking about basic provisions that would drive a national system, what do you see as what those basic provisions would be? Would it be setting a minimum return deposit and saying that this should apply to all of a certain class of beverage bottles? Or how would you, if you were kind of at the whiteboard saying, hey, maybe this would work, how would you design that?
Well, one of the things that we would make sure is it's not just soda bottles, but it's also water bottles, and we've worked to expand existing deposit legislation over the years to include water bottles, because they've exploded over the years. And so I think that that's really what we would focus on, is make sure you can bring in one class. Because unfortunately, with the diversity of resin, you want to make sure you're getting one class, a homogeneous class of material through that, right? So you don't have the contamination levels and things like that, and you begin to create the highest value in the secondary market of the material. So we would think it should be focused on one class of container, be it a PET container or something along those lines.
So you're suggesting, like, rather than having the deposit system in Oregon covers basically based on what's in the bottle, but doesn't say it has to be just PET or HDPE. But are you saying it'd be better to focus just on, say, PET bottles?
That certainly would be. It's the most iconic package out there, and it's the easiest for the consumer to understand, and that would drive, we think, the greatest consumer participation.
So if we were to say each state needs to have a recycling system for beverages that focuses on PET containers and at a certain minimum deposit rate, those states could then expand on that. They could expand in the Oregon model. They're deciding, how do you return them? Do you return them to a recycling center? Do you return them to the store? Do they raise the rates higher than that? Do they include other types of plastic once they have the system set up, more flexibility? But if we were to start with a basic national system, you'd be recommending a minimum deposit rate and just PET bottles?
Go ahead, you asked the question.
Well, again, I think I'd really have to think about that, to be honest, because I'm hesitant to say, again, that Maine would be able to handle that, given the rural nature versus, say, what Jules is able to do in the area of say, the metropolitan area of Portland and Oregon. That sounds like a great idea, to be honest with you. I think some basic framework is important. Whether or not something as specific as that, frankly, I'd have to take a look at it, to be honest.
Well, Mr. Alexander, I'll just ask if you'll continue to use your expertise in the plastics world to help us figure out what the basics of a national framework would be very helpful.
We appreciate the opportunity, and we will take advantage of that. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey?
Senator, if I may just color one little bit of testimony here. From the perspective of somebody who operates this every day for customers that come in the door, I think it's really challenging to tell a customer that one bottle, because it's one material, and another bottle that looks the same but might be a slightly different material, one's redeemable and one's not. That's really confusing to people. And the most disappointed customer is the customer that leaves with the bottles that they brought in to redeem. And so I think making sure that we also have a system that's easily understandable for Americans, for customers that come in, and that really covers a broad range of all of the glass, plastic, and metal bottles that are out there, as broad as possible, is not only, I think, good for supply and for the environment, but it's better for customers.
So make it as little confusing as possible, clear labeling, clear definitions. I will ask or challenge you to do the same thing, which is to lay out what you think the basics of a national architecture might look like that leaves a lot of flexibility to individual states to have us so that we can start wrestling with and have that conversation with our national producers and see if there is a pathway. Would you kind of do your whiteboard exercise and get it back to us?
Yes, Senator, and just in very brief, I think you assign the refund value. I don't know that you even need to mandate the deposit, but you just assign the refund value, you assign the responsible parties, and you assign a target, and then from there you let it play out. And that, I think, is really the most basic system that you can have.
Okay, we'll write that up and provide it back to us. Thank you. And Ms. Collins, same exercise. Can you go through that with your insights?
I've got it written down.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank you all very much for participating in the conversation. I think how we handle our containers is a significant part of the issue of waste and environmental improvement and energy savings. It's a win on many levels. Job creation is you've all pointed out. And so I'll look forward to your insights as we work to try to create a conversation. Here, half a century after Senator Hatfield worked at that same conversation, and I know that there's a number of my colleagues across the aisle who really have started to see the impact of plastics on, especially those ocean states, and would like to ponder if there's a framework that could make sense, both as good policy and perhaps good politics. So, in closing, thank you all for appearing today and sharing your perspectives. Some housekeeping. I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a variety of articles and materials that include letters from stakeholders and other materials that relate to today's hearing. Hearing no objection. So ordered. Additionally, senators will be allowed to submit written questions for the record through the close of business on Thursday, October 12th. We'll compile those questions, send them out to our witnesses. We'll ask for you to get replies back by October 26th. With that, the hearing is adjourned.